Okay, first of all, let's talk about the P/E ratio. P/E stands for price to earnings, and the P/E ratio is easily calculated by taking the market value of the stock and dividing it by the earnings per share. For example, a particular stock is selling at a price of $40 a share, and its earnings per share is $2. So, in order to calculate its P/E ratio, you simply take the selling price and divide it by the earnings per share. So the P/E ratio is 20 times. This ratio explains that the investors are willing to pay $20 for every $1 in earnings from the company's stock. In reality, many investors use this ratio as an indicator for determining whether the stock is undervalued or overvalued. If the P/E ratio is low, this means that the stock is undervalued or it's cheap to buy, and vice versa. If the P/E ratio is high, this means that the stock is overvalued or expensive. This ratio seems really helpful for the investors to make their investment decisions. However, the big question is, how much is high and how much is low? In fact, it's actually hard to determine which P/E ratio is low and which P/E ratio is high, because the average P/E ratio varies among different stocks and industries. So this ratio tends to be inaccurate, and therefore, we'll need to use another ratio which can help us determine when the stock is undervalued and when it's overvalued. In order to assess the current price of the stock, you can use the PEG ratio. PEG stands for price to earnings to growth, and the PEG ratio is calculated by taking the P/E ratio and dividing it by the estimated earnings per share growth rate. Similar to other financial ratios, you don't need to calculate this ratio because it's always available for free on the internet. The PEG ratio reflects how the current value of the stock is compared to its future growth. If the PEG ratio is less than 1, this means that the stock is undervalued or it's cheap to buy. If the PEG ratio is greater than 1, this means that the stock is overvalued or expensive. If the PEG ratio is equal to 1, this means that the stock is selling at a reasonable price, and it will be considered a fair investment. So our criterion is that you should only buy the stock when its PEG ratio is less than or equal to 1. This simply means that you'll buy the stock when it's undervalued or fairly priced. So there will be a higher chance that you can easily make a profit when the stock increases in value.